Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director and the host of the show. And with us, after a break of a couple weeks, is the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with the great Brandon Vaught, too.
Well, listen, I just got home maybe an hour ago from the big USCCB convocation. USCCB is United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and they brought together over 3,500 Catholic leaders from around the country right here in my backyard to Orlando, where they had a big 4-day gathering of bishops, priests, leaders, catechists, evangelists, leaders of movements and ecclesial groups. And at the very end of it, you gave a rousing call to arms there. Tell us a little bit about your closing keynote talk.
Yeah, well, I gave it, first of all, at a distance, as you know. I was supposed to be there in person, and I won't name the airline, but to make a long story short, I was all set to go, and then my flight got canceled. And then it just caused all kinds of difficulties, and it was just, really hard to rearrange. But happily, they said, why don't you go to the EWTN studios in Orange County, which is about a 3-hour drive from Santa Barbara. But went down there and recorded. I didn't record it. I gave the talk live, and they were able to broadcast it. So that was great. My talk was 3 obstacles and 3 opportunities when it comes to evangelization. And I told the folks that it's born of a lot of concrete experience I've had with evangelizing, especially younger people. And the blocks were, you've all heard me talk about them before, but first one was scientism. This tendency to reduce all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. And I see it everywhere. Call it naturalism too, or materialism, that all that's real is what can be scientifically verified, and everything else is just so much nonsense. And so that's a major block. If we're going to speak of God, and God by definition is not an item in the universe, we can't empirically verify the existence of God, though there are very important rational paths to God, to be sure. Anyway, though, so I was characterizing scientism, and then what I call the culture, anything goes. There's no real truth, no real value. It's all subjective and relative, and so there's no real oomph. There's no purpose and get up and go. The society becomes enervated, and then relatedly, there's what I call the culture of self-invention. So if there's no real objective truth by which I measure my life, well, I just make it up as I go along. My freedom determines who I am. So Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche and their disciples have now become the masterminds of today, And then I just went through 3 opportunities under the rubric of the true and the good and the beautiful. And I did my usual, ranting and raving about dumbed down Catholicism and the need to embrace our intellectual tradition. And I urged everyone, I made it real concrete. I said, I think every single person involved in evangelization, apologetics, catechesis should have a really good, clear argument for God's existence, because I think it's just a block for an awful lot of young people. They think it's just a lot of nonsense. So it doesn't mean you have to be a master of all the different routes, but get one. And I suggested the argument from contingency, which I think is the most compelling, Well, just to finish it up, the true, then the good and the beautiful. The good is simply the idea that from the beginning, Christianity has evangelized through the radicality of its form of life. So from the earliest days, how these Christians love one another, that's what struck non-Christians and drew a lot of them into the church. And then I went up and down the centuries and then said today, during our time of crisis and scandal, we need that more than ever as a radical living out of the Christian life. And then finally, the beautiful. And I relied there on one of my favorite Catholic philosophers, the great Dietrich von Hildebrand, and the distinction between the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. So the truly beautiful is not just something I like, but it's something which, by its sheer value and quality, reaches into me, rearranges me, and sends me on mission. So that's when you show the beauty of the Catholic tradition, that's what you're relying on, because it all goes back to the beauty of the incarnation, of the cross and resurrection. So anyway, that was my talk in a nutshell.
Oh, it was an excellent talk. You got a huge ovation. I know being there in the room while they were streaming this episode, there's a couple of powerful one-liners that everybody was quoting afterward. In one instance, you said, "I hate dumbed down Catholicism," and like people were dancing in the chairs to hear that. So
if that's on my tombstone, I'd be okay with that. And it'd be realized enemy of dumbed down Catholicism. And, I saw it on some of the social media that it was kind of a throwaway line, but that the saints love a good fight, and I think that's true. Up and down the centuries, the great saints respond when there's a crisis in the church or there's a great enemy of the church. The saints rise up, and so we have a fight in our hands. And you and I have both talked a lot. I think you did at this conference about the nuns, right? The NONES, and the numbers are not encouraging, and we shouldn't blind ourselves to that. But it's okay. We got a fight in our hands, as did Ignatius of Loyola, as did Benedict of Nursia, as did Origen of Alexandria, go up and down the century, as did Thomas Aquinas. So we got to rise to the occasion as they did.
Well, we could do a whole nother episode on that, and maybe we will. I think by the time this episode airs, your talk, they recorded it. EWTN was there. They're going to put it online, so we'll be sure to have a link to the full talk if you want to watch it on the podcast page. But today, we're going to be talking about sort of an off-the-wall subject, a little different than we usually do. The title of today's episode is How Bishop Barron Reads and Writes. And we got this idea online. There's lots of websites. Maybe the most famous one is Life Hacker, where they peek into the lives of successful leaders, entrepreneurs, CEOs, and figure out, how do they study? How do they learn? How do they grow? So I thought we'd do that same thing with you, Bishop. So let's maybe break this up into two sections here. First, reading, and then later on, we'll talk a little bit about your writing. So first reading. Give us a general sense of how you read, how you pick your books. Do you have any methods or styles? Talk a little bit about your reading habits.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I've been all my life a pretty voracious reader. There's hardly ever a moment when I'm not reading something. My eyes are starting to give way now that I've reached a certain age. But from the time I could read, I've been reading. And, from the time I was a teenager, I got really interested in philosophy and in especially religious philosophy, and then by extension to theology. Like when I was a kid, though, my favorite books were on sports. So I read a lot of I'm going to date myself here, but Jerry Kramer, who was a lineman for the Green Bay Packers in the 1960s, wrote a book that was on the Packers championship season, instant replay. And I read that thing probably 10 times as a kid. So sports, and then it morphed into this more serious philosophical, theological. To this day, if I walk into a bookstore, like we got a cool bookstore in Santa Barbara called Chaucer's. It's been walking distance of my house. And I was in there a couple of days ago, and just instinctually, I go to the theology section, and they have philosophy and theology next to each other. So I tend to gravitate to that, I read a lot of book reviews, so I get a lot of journals and magazines, and I'll get a newspaper that will mention a book, and frequently I'll get it or order it, or if a book grabs my attention that way. Sometimes you read because of a project, So I just finished, as we're speaking, really, I finished this script for the Flannery O'Connor episode. So I had the great joy of then going back into her writing. I read a lot of the stories again, read through the whole book of her letters, read her wonderful little book called Mystery and Manners. So if I'm working on a project, I'll go into books of a certain type. But I still have kind of wide Catholic, small c Catholic taste in reading. I still like to read novels and love history, love biography. I would tend probably after philosophy and theology to go to those sections.
There's the famous quote from Sir Francis Bacon where he says that some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. Do you read books in different ways depending on genre, style? Talk about that.
Yeah, I don't have my Stairmaster out here now in Santa Barbara, but all my years at Mundelein, I used to go pretty much every day, and I'd work out on a Stairmaster, I put music in my ears, and I would read. Well, I'm not going to read the Critique of Pure Reason, on the
on the Stairmaster
while I'm listening to rock and roll. So I had books I called Stairmaster books, which were books that they're good and important, but they weren't like super complex. And I kind of read at them, maybe. I'd read them, but not with tremendous focus. Sometimes you read a book. I remember Jack Shea, who taught me many years ago, he said, if I'm reading a book and I realize pretty quickly that I could have written this book, I put it down. And it sounds maybe pretentious, but if you're in your own field, I understand what he means. He's like, yeah, I got this. I could write the next page of this book. Why am I reading it? So I will do that. I'll just say, no, I'm not going to waste my time plowing through this book. I could have written it myself. So that happens. And then sometimes you run out of steam with a book. You get bogged down, or you lose interest, or another book intervenes. Frequently enough, I'll find a book on my shelf with the bookmark still in it. And it wasn't that I got bored with it. It's just that something else came along and distracted me. And I'll pick it right up and say, okay, sure, I remember this book. I remember that story. I remember this argument. I'm going to get right back into this book. So I do that too. And then one of my things, Brandon, when I'm reading a book that I know I'm going to use for my work, I always read it with a pen. Like the Flannery books, for example, for this project, they're now just covered in ink. Because as I read it more seriously, I want to make sure I'm notating to myself what I'm, finding really important and interesting, so that when I go back to it, I can access it. I often argue with a book, when I have a pen in my hand. What? Question mark. Crazy, or like frequently in this one, as I'm going through it, right, exclamation point, good, So I'll kind of have a conversation with the book as I go through it. But that's if I'm reading something, more seriously.
Whenever I first started really getting into reading, one of the most difficult things for me was to give up a book that I'd started. I don't know if it's because I'm an engineer, because I'm a perfectionist. I like to finish what I start. But when I realized that it's okay not to finish a book you started, it was so liberating, and it enabled me to read so many more books. Do you have a hard time giving up a book?
No, but see, that you're giving the book there too much credit, because life is too short. Life is too short, and we can't, even you and I are both kind of voracious readers. But didn't you do that a while ago? Didn't you say that even if you're a world champion reader of all time, you're plowing through, 2 and 3 books a week, even at that pace, you're only going to read several thousand books maybe in your whole reading life. Therefore, I would say don't waste your time on a book that is, for whatever reason, not worth it. Sometimes, it's your fault, and you should come on, get in there and finish it. But I think at other times, no, there are other books I should be reading. Also, given this fact that life is short and we only have, very limited time, you should focus on really good books. You shouldn't waste your time on a lot of silly stuff or a lot of subpar. You should read the classics, the great books. You only got so much time.
In C.S. Lewis's preface to Athanasius's book On the Incarnation, that sounds really long and pretentious, but it's this famous little essay that C.S. Lewis wrote on reading the old books. And he had this advice where he said, for every new book you read, and he defined new book as a book written in your current century, you should read at least 3 old books. And if that was too much for you, he said, at least alternate. What do you think of that advice?
Very good. I think it's excellent advice. Because we can get into a sort of presentism where I'm just preoccupied with the issues of this time. And the books that have lasted a long time is because there's a lot of substance in them. They wouldn't have been around that long. A classic. So David Tracy talks about that. I mean, a classic text. And how do you approach a classic, and what makes something truly classic? I think it means a book that is so profound that it keeps generating meaning over lifetimes. And if it does that, it means there's something profoundly right in it. I think of like the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, which Father Robert Sokolowski years ago said we should read every year of our life as we move through life. And I haven't done that, but I've read it a lot. I've gone back to it a lot. And it's one of those, it's a classic because it just keeps generating meaning as you go. Or, a great novel, Moby Dick or something like that you could read 100 times and never really exhaust. Those are the books you should be reading.
Now, you've talked before about teaching courses at Mundelein on John Henry Newman, on von Balthasar, on Luther, and in preparation for these courses, you would pour through their entire corpus. You would just read book after book after book of these figures. Do you do a lot of that systematic reading now, or are you more just sort of one-off picking different books?
I mean, less now because I'm not teaching at that same level. And yeah, when I was doing that full time, I'm going to teach a course in Urs von Balthasar. Well, heck, I've got to really be a master now of this corpus, or I'm going to be a lousy teacher of it. I remember this is years ago when I resolved to do that course. And the reason was I was very intrigued by him, but I felt I didn't know him that well. So I thought, okay, if I offer a course, it'll compel me to read him. So I did. I read, I'm guessing in the ballpark of 4,000 pages, because to get through what they call the trilogy, the first part of the trilogy is 5 volumes. Second part of the trilogy is about 7 volumes. Third part is another like 4 volumes. So to get through all of that, that's a lot of time reading. Same with Newman. I think I read the 4 great books of Newman. And then you branch off from there. But yeah, when I was doing that, I would read in a very systematic way. I can do that much less now.
Let's talk about reading speed. I think 20, 30 years ago, the whole speed reading phenomenon really took off. It still has proponents today. How do you read in terms of speed? Do you skim? Do you skip? Do you vary the speed? How about that?
It just depends. I think I do read pretty fast. That's just from a lot of experience. I remember as a little kid, this back in the 60s, early 70s, we had these things where we'd all sit there and they'd run the words across a screen, and we'd have to read them, and then they would up the speed and all this. I think they dropped that sort of stuff, but I think I just do read pretty fast. But I'll say this, when I'm reading something really serious with a pen, if you read with a pen and you're doing a lot of underlining, you're just ipso facto reading it twice or maybe 3 times, because you read it, oh, that's interesting. Now I'm going to underline it. When I underline it, I read it again, right? When I make a comment on the side, I might be reading it a 3rd time. So even though I say, oh, I'm reading this book, in fact, sections of it you're reading 3 times maybe. So that's a way to do it. I think the pen slows you down. If you're going too quickly and you're kind of just skimming, and there's no way you can read Thomas Aquinas or John Henry Newman or Urs von Balthasar in a skimming way. I mean, it's just silly. So get the pen in your hand and make sure that you're marking. With those people, there's something on every page. It's really worth mulling over. Here's a hint too. I mentioned David Tracy already. Years ago, I got the Analogical Imagination of David Tracy, which is one of his major books. But I've always said his footnotes were a theological education, because I was a young guy at the time and just kind of getting started in theology. But you read Tracy, and then he had these wonderful footnotes, lengthy, elaborated footnotes, and he was telling you everything he was reading. And you say, I've heard of that guy. I make a note, and I better read him. And then, oh, there's that name again. He's important. I never heard of him either. And then you take another note. So find a great author who has really good footnotes. I think is a great way to guide your own reading.
Let's wrap up the reading section here with an objection that I hear all the time. I'm sure you do too. You encourage people to read, but then many people will say, well, I'm just not a reader. I don't have the time. I'm not a good reader. I can't squeeze it into my schedule. What advice would you give to someone who feels like reading's just kind of not for them?
Well, I mean, maybe it's not, and that's okay. I mean, some people are much more pragmatically oriented, and that's okay. Not everyone is given to that. There's some people who are super smart, but they're smart in kind of a pragmatic way. That's okay. I'm sorry, I wouldn't say every single person's got to be plowing through. But I'd say this: when I say that read, is if you want to do apologetics and evangelization, well, then you got to make that commitment. It's like saying I want to be a car repairman, but I just don't like mechanics very much. Or I want to be a surgeon, but I just don't care for anatomy. So that's when I think you've got to just buckle down and do it. Part of it is habituation. You get good at it by doing it. And the more you read in a given area, the easier it becomes, because now all the connections are being made. And you see how this author influences that author and how this idea is born of that idea. So I think just you do it. You get better at it by doing it.
When you first went out to California, you were doing the drive between Santa Barbara and Los Angeles, about 2.5 hours, a lot. And I remember you were doing a lot of audiobooks. You still doing those?
Yeah, I am indeed. In fact, today, driving back from Anaheim to Santa Barbara, and it was the 4th of July, so there was no traffic. So I made it in about 2 hours and 15 minutes. You know what I'm listening to now is Gone with the Wind. So, I'd seen the movie, of course, a number of times, but I'd never actually read the great book, Gone with the Wind. And the reason I was attracted to it was it's so long, and I need a lot of time. I have these big trips. So I'm about halfway through it, I'd say, now. But it's a magnificent experience, and it's read wonderfully by this very gifted narrator, does the voices and everything. So, yeah, I do that. I've listened to a number of Hemingway novels. I listened to Lewis. I did the Great Divorce. I listened to in the car. What else? A whole slew of them. So, yes, I do that.
I tell people, maybe reading's not your thing. Maybe it's tough for you to squeeze in your schedule, but the average commute time in America is 25 to 30 minutes. So you can do the math. If you listen to audiobooks during that time, you can knock out between 20 and 30 books a year. So I think audiobooks are real underappreciated.
No, I agree. And of course, it harkens back to the beginnings of literature and communication, which were verbal. I mean, these stories are meant to be told and with voices and all that. So I like it. I think it's a much more kind of elemental way to experience a book.
Okay, so we've taken a peek into some of your reading habits. Let's change gears now to writing. One usually breeds the other. So let's talk a little bit about writing. Talk about, I guess, maybe when you were an early seminarian, or maybe let's back up a little bit. When you're doing your master's and your doctoral work, was writing something that came naturally, or was that something a skill you had to develop?
No, I've always been a pretty good writer from the time I was a kid. I remember, though, very vividly, a freshman in high school, we had a great teacher, and I think of him almost every day when I write, because he taught us grammar. And in those days, I don't know if they still do now, but he taught grammar as a drill sergeant, And we all had to write an essay every week. And I remember what he would do is, without naming the person, he would read an essay that he thought was really bad, and then he would sort of go after it, right? So one week, I'm 14 years old, and I'd written something, and he chose mine, to read as a particularly bad essay. And so it really bugged me. It really bothered me. And I think it did what he wanted to do. It sort of lit a fire in me that said, well, I'm going to get this. And I came actually to love grammar and syntax. And I'm a stickler for grammar today and for spelling and all that. So, I always liked to write. I remember when I did my master's paper at Catholic U, we knew it had to be about 70 pages. And I remember this seemed so daunting at the time, to write 70 pages. I mean, how could you ever do that? But, you knuckle down and you do it. I read it now. It's god awful, the writing of it. But you do it. And then, okay, I managed that. I was able to write a 70-page paper. And then the next one was my STL paper in theology, which is like a master's paper, same length, maybe 75, 80 pages. And then the next step was the doctoral paper, and that was about 600 pages. So I wrote that when I was in Paris. So it just, comes with time. I've always admired great writers, and I don't think I'm a great writer, but I've always tried to write well, which to me usually means clearly. You know what I mean? I don't want to, that's too reductive to say it just that way, but that's a lot of it in my judgment. Is to write well is to write clearly. I've always been, I think, able to do that. And then I've never stopped writing since I wrote that doctoral paper. I started work in 1991 on that, and I've never not been writing a book since then, or a major, essay or a paper or something. So I'm at it all the time, and then it's just you grow with the craft.
The great writing teacher William Zinsser, in his book On Writing Well, says exactly what you just did. He said, good writing is clear writing. And when I think about my favorite writers, the cream of the crop for me is C.S. Lewis. And I think the reason people are so drawn to him is for his remarkable clarity. He's so clear. Who are some of your favorite writers?
Well, I'll tell you, I mentioned one already, and that's Robert Sokolowski. If you read him as a philosophical writer, because philosophy is famously obscure, and usually they think, the higher and smarter you are, the more obscure you're writing. I'm with Walter Kaufmann on that, the great commentator, who said, au contraire, He said, the greater the thinker, the clearer the writing. And he used that, by the way, as a criterion. And there's something really right about it, that he thought people like Heidegger, who wrote very poorly, were poor thinkers. So Sokolowski, read him. I've told students over the years some who are trying to learn English, but native English speakers too, native English writers, read Sokolowski, to read someone who writes very deeply and very clearly. Someone too, that influenced me a lot when I was younger was Thomas Merton. And as a spiritual writer, I've always admired Merton's style of writing. It's clear, it's funny, it's accessible, but not superficial. There's a kind of bracing quality to it I've always admired. And now I'll speak on the other side of my mouth. I also love the kind of grand, romantic, over-the-top stylists, like a Faulkner. I love Melville, and you wouldn't say he's characterized by a Hemingway-esque, economy of expression. I love someone like William Styron, Sophie's Choice, and those kind of grander, more romantic stylists. So I like that too, I go back to I'll mention his name now, Mr. Langendorfer. He was my teacher. I've lost track of him. I don't know if he's still in the land of the living or not, but Mr. Langendorfer taught us these basic moves, to vary the rhythm of your sentences. And I think there's a lot to that. It's often the rhythm of a writer that I'll admire. That as you're going along, it's like a song, the way song will change chords or something. Unless there's that variety in the writing, it becomes sort of stale. And, he used to say to us, don't just give me the subject, verb, object over again. Is throw a question in, put a introductory clause, etc. So I still remember those basic moves, and they're all about rhythm, I think. Or I think of like a William F. Buckley, maybe younger people don't remember him, but great self-conscious sort of stylist many years ago. And one time on his program, he used the word exiguous. And the person said to him, what does it even mean? And he said, it means small. He said, why didn't you say small then? He said, I needed the extra syllables. In other words, the rhythm of his sentence required extra syllables. So, now the flip side of William F. Buckley, and I remember this as well, Hemingway was asked by his son, what's the key to good writing? And Hemingway, one of the great stylists, said, never use two words when one will do. And that's a very simple, and it sounds simplistic, but it's not, if you think about it. You're moving along in a sentence and you say, well, I can say this in a more convoluted way, or I can say this more simply. Always do it more simply. The other one, the great Graham Greene, also a well-known stylist, was asked, how do you achieve this style? And he said, I go back over everything I've written. I take out every adjective and every adverb. And read him, and you'll notice that something about adverbs and adjectives make the writings too cluttered, or it makes it too self-conscious or something. So anyway, those are all different approaches, and I suppose I've benefited from all of them in different ways.
We talked a little bit about reading. We've talked about writing. Let's wrap up by combining those two things. I want to talk about writing books and your process for doing that. You've written several books over the years, and I'm guessing your style has probably changed a little bit from book to book. But in general, how do you approach writing a book? I'm assuming you don't just show up in front of the computer with a blank page. How do you do your research? How do you pull things together before you even put finger to keyboard?
Yeah, often that's what's happening is your topic. So there's something you're interested in, and so you start reading around that topic. And then that will usually distill itself into a handful of major moves or major motifs. And then under each of those headings, you start doing more pointed research. So you'll say, now in this area, I need to read the following people. And then you put all that like into a bucket. And then the next theme, and put those people in a bucket. So that's kind of the background. Then at some stage, though, you do have to lay out the structure of it. I remember one time, many years ago, my book, And Now I See, which came out a long time ago. But I remember distinctly at Mundelein, I was giving an exam in this big big lecture room we had, and I gave out the exam, and I had now an hour and a half, just monitoring proctoring the exam. So I said to the guys, just ignore me. I'm gonna scribble stuff on the board. And what I did on the board was I basically outlined that book. I just to help me think it through. So I had the three major sections, and then now I have a literary person in each one. Then there's going to be a theological element in each one, and I just kind of threw it all up on the blackboard. And then I said, before iPhones, I would have taken a photo of it now, but I then sat down and scribbled all that out, and that did indeed become the outline for that book. When I'm actually writing, what I typically do is I will get down on the computer and I'll just start. And I'll do it in terms of kind of bullet points to distinguish it from the actual crafted version bullet point. And then I'll just start writing. And I'm not worrying here now about sentences, about getting it just right, about rhythms or anything like that. I just start writing. And I might do a chapter that way. And I might get like 40 pages where I've just kind of written my way through it. Then I'll print those out, I put them up, and then when I actually sit down to write, that's a kind of, I always think of it as the cartoon, when Michelangelo would paint back in those days. Cartoon is just the preliminary drawing, and he'd affix the preliminary drawing to the ceiling, and then he would make marks there and then actually do the painting, So this preliminary thing is a bit like that. It's the main markings of the chapter. And then as I go through, I'm referring to it. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes that sentence is okay, but usually I'm working it. Here's a weird thing about book writing, and of course you're a book writer too. I wonder if you sense this. There's a moment when your book is in a way beyond you. It's escaped your control. It's now facing you as another thing. The book is not something you're completely in control of anymore. Now I've reached the 348th page of this book. Do I even remember what I wrote back on page 27? And it confronts you like an other, not like your creation anymore. And that's always an interesting moment.
Yeah, lots of writers, I think, compare the book writing process to the gestation phase of a baby, and the publishing is the giving birth. But along the way, during the gestation period, there is a moment when you sort of realize this is another being. This isn't just part of me. This is something emerging from me.
Yeah, that's the experience. That's a better way to put it. It's another thing, and it's kind of like it's looking back at me, and it's and it's both wonderful and kind of disconcerting, that moment.
I got two more questions for you. One is this: in terms of your writing sessions, I got writer friends who will check into a hotel or go to a writing cabin and write from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and finish a book in a few weeks. My style is more plodding. I write maybe an hour a day. How do you usually write? Long chunks, small chunks? How do you do it?
What I usually, when I go back to my Mundelein time when I was writing a lot of books, I'd often do it in the summer because you have more time. And I get to my office at like 8 o'clock. And for me, the morning is the best time because writing, we've been talking a lot about it, but the bottom line is it's like breaking rocks to me. It's very hard work. It's very taxing work to write a good English sentence. So I work best in the morning when I'm alert. And I'll go from like 8 until noon. And this goes back, actually, I think about it now, to my doctoral rhythm. When I was doing my doctoral paper, I wrote 6 pages a day during that third year because I wanted to get the thing done. So that was my goal, was to write 6 pages per day. And I could do that usually by starting about 8:30, and I'd finish. We had lunch in Paris back in those days at 1. So I'd finish about 1. And then I was shot for the day. After that, I couldn't really work anymore. So I'd go for a walk, or I'd take a nap or something, or I'd go to, I'd wander around, and I wouldn't work at night either. I mean, that was it for writing. And I still find that's true. If I'm doing a major project, it's best to write in the morning. And then when I've worked that much on writing, I'm done. I'm done for the day.
Final question here. What was your favorite book to write and why?
Yeah, that's hard. It's a bit like who's your favorite child, I suppose,
Oh, yeah.
I remember very much enjoying writing the Second Samuel book, which is the last I think like the last academic book that I've written. Will I write another one? I don't know. With my current life, I'm not sure. But I remember enjoying that very much, and I think it was because it was a bit outside my usual field. It was biblical stuff, and I enjoyed immensely the research around that book. I also think of And Now I See, which came out, I think, in 1998, maybe. So I was writing it in 96, 97. I remember enjoying that book. I did a lot of literary things at Flannery O'Connor and Dante and Faulkner and others. I remember enjoying that, maybe because it was more Catholic, small c. I was doing a lot of different things in it. It was more poetic. I was consciously writing in a more poetic way in that book. So I think those two would come to mind.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. If you have a question, we would love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com and you can record your question on any device. Today we're hearing from Brad, who has a question related to reading books, this subject we've been talking about here. So here's Brad's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Brad, and I'm from Ohio. I'm wondering what advice you have on choosing books to read about Christianity or the spiritual life from non-Catholic Christian authors. How do I ensure that what I read is sound and reputable? Thank you for all your work at Word on Fire.
Yes, good question. I'd say here are a couple things I'd say. Make sure you've got a good grounding in the catechism. So if you're concerned about maintaining your Catholic faith, make sure you've got that clear in your mind. You know what the church is teaching. Make sure you're grounded, furthermore, in the classics of the Catholic tradition. Now, that means Augustine and Aquinas and Newman and, the great figures. If that grounding's in place, then I think you can wander with a certain confidence into other areas. Like, I spent a large chunk of my life reading Paul Tillich because I wrote on for my doctoral work. Now, I was doing Aquinas and Tillich. And to this day, I've benefited enormously from that little adventure into Paul Tillich. I would pull back in very serious ways from Tillich. I would disagree with him, but I benefited enormously from him. Brandon, you and I both reverence C.S. Lewis, who's a non-Catholic, obviously, but of enormous power. So I think as long as you got the foundation in place, you know what you're about, what the church is about, then you can wander with a certain confidence. Also, I'd say this is you take the advice, if you want, of great figures. So this author, whom you really trust and know, has led you to this other author. So there's probably something worth knowing there, And then so you reach a point when you'll get more confident in your own critical faculty, when you can say, yeah, I kind of know how to make the right judgments here. But see, one thing I'm harping a little bit on this, but I'm kind of wary of is a hyper defensive approach to reading, as though, oh my gosh, it's religion and my salvation. And so I will never venture outside of the confines of even, let's say, a very conservative Catholicism. That's too narrow. Aquinas didn't read that way, right? He read Moses Maimonides and Averroes and Avicenna and Cicero and Aristotle and Plato. He read wildly outside the Christian tradition. Fine. Now it's Thomas Aquinas. He's a genius. He knew how to read those people critically. But that's my model of a Catholic mind, is someone like Thomas Aquinas.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. I hope you've picked up some great reading and writing tips here. Hey, listen, we got a special offer for you, only for listeners of the Word on Fire show. We have a coupon code that you can use on Bishop Barron's newest film series. The film series is called David the King. It's a 6-part film series looking at the life of David and David as this central pivot point in salvation history. So if you go to davidtheking.com, and use the coupon code DAVID when you order the film series on either DVD or Blu-ray. So the coupon code's DAVID. You can save $10 today. So again, only for you, special deal. Be sure to go to davidtheking.com and use the coupon code DAVID and save $10 on the series. Well, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.